Welcome back to On the Same Page. We are on Daf Lamed Ches Amud Aleph, 38a of Maseches Kiddushin, and we are about, 11 lines down the page. The Gemara last week segued into the topic of the man. It was talking about the idea of Chadash, of not eating from the new crop, and how when they entered the land of Israel, they waited till the second day of Pesach to eat from the crop. So it was a question of whether they were keeping Chadash. One opinion said that they know that they just ran out of man that day, and that's why they had to then start, and only then did they start eating from the produce of the land of Israel. So on that topic, the Gemara says, again, 11 lines down in the middle of the line, it says, Tanya idach. Another brisa taught, Ubnei Yisrael achu es haman arba'im shana. The pasuk says, in Parshas Beshalach, that Bnei Yisrael, the Jewish people, ate man for 40 years. Asks the Gemara, V'chi arba'im shana achu, did they really eat man for 40 years? V'halo arba'im shana chaser shloshim yom achu. They only ate man for 40 years minus 30 days. And the Gemara doesn't think that the Torah would be inexact. They only ate for 40 years minus 30 days. Why so? Because they left Egypt on the 15th of Nisan. They arrived in Israel 40 years later, right around that time on the 10th of Nisan. But the man only began to fall, they only began to eat man 30 days into their journey. Rashi quotes the Psukim because it says, and they traveled from Elim and they came to Midbar Sin, and it says that was the 15th of the second month. So it was a month later, it was Nisan Iyar. After they left, a month later, they got to Midbar Sin, and that's where it says that God says, I'm going to provide you with man. So it was only a month into their travels that they began to have the man. So therefore it should be 40 years minus 30 days. Up till then, what were they eating? They were eating the matzah and things that they brought out with them from Egypt. So the Gemara says, why does it say they ate man for 40 years? It's to teach you, Ugo showed Mitzrayim, Tamu Bahem Taman, that the cakes or the matzahs that they brought out of Egypt, they tasted like the man. That's what it's teaching you, that actually there was a miracle already prior to the man, which was that the matzah which they were being sustained by, the food that they were being sustained by, in that first month also tasted like the man. And therefore the pasuk says that they ate man for 40 years, even though it was really 40 years minus 30 days, but even those 30 days, it was like they were eating man because the ugos, the cakes, the matzah that they brought out, tasted like man. Tanya, we have another brayso. So while we're on these types of topics, we'll now examine the life and death of Moshe. The Gemara says, B'shiva ba'adar meis Moshe. Moshe Rabbeinu died on the 7th of Adar, on Zayin Adar. This relates to actually what last week's Gemara had said, that after Moshe died, the man stopped, and then they had leftovers that they consumed until they ran out. So this elaborates on that. On the 7th of Adar, Moshe died, of B'shiva ba'adar nolad. And he was born on the 7th of Adar. Minayin shebeshiva ba'adar meis. How do we know that he died on the 7th of Adar? It doesn't say that explicitly in the Torah. It also doesn't say explicitly when he was born, and the Gemara will ask about that. But how do we know he died on the 7th of Adar? Shenemar, because the pasuk says, right at the end of the Torah, it says, Vayama sham Moshe eved Hashem. And Moshe, the servant of God, died there. Uksiv, and it says, Vayivku b'nei Yisrael Moshe be'arvos Moav shloshim yom. It says that Bnei Yisrael cried for Moshe in Arvos Moab, in the plains of Moab, for 30 days. Uksiv, and it says, this is now a pasuk in Yehoshua, which the story continues right into Yehoshua. It says, Vayachrei Mos Moshe eved Hashem. It was after Moshe, the servant of Hashem, died, and Yehoshua begins to talk and to take over. Uksiv, and it says, Moshe avdi meis. Hashem says to Yehoshua, in that conversation, it says that after Moshe died, Hashem said to Yoshua, he said, Moshe abdi meis, Moshe my servant has died, Ve'ata kumavor, you get up and cross the Yarden, bring the Jewish people into the land of Israel, Yoshua. Uksiv, and it says that Hashem said to Yoshua, Ivru b'kerev ha'machaneh, pass within the camp, v'tzivu es ha'am lemor, and command the nation, saying, Heichinu lachem tzeda, they should prepare food. Ki ba'od shloshes yamim ta'avru es ha'yarden, because in 3 days you're going to cross the Yarden. So the Gemara understands that this conversation that Hashem had with Yoshua occurred right after those 30 days of mourning. And Hashem tells Yoshua, tell the people that they should prepare to cross the Yarden in 3 days. Uksiv, and it says, V'ha'am alu min ha'yarden be'asar lachodesh harishon. It says that the nation went up from the Jordan, they crossed the Jordan on the 10th of the first month, the 10th of Nisan. So they went into Eretz Yisrael over the Yarden on the 10th of Nisan, which was the 3rd day of preparation. So you have 3 days from the 10th of Nisan working backwards. So you have 10, 9, 8, and or 8, 9, and 10 is occupied by those preparation days, and then you have 30 days of mourning. So if you go back 30 days from the 7th of Nisan, so you end up at the 7th of Adar. So that is how we know that Moshe died on the 7th of Adar, because there were 33 days after he died before they entered the land of Israel. And they entered the land of Israel on the 10th of Nisan. That's explicit in the Pasuk. So that's what the Gemara says. Tzei mehen shloshim u'shlosha yamim l'mafreya. Remove 33 days backwards. Go back 33 days. Halamata, that teaches you shebeshiva ba'adar meis Moshe, that Moshe died on the 7th of Adar. Uminayin shebeshiva ba'adar nolad Moshe. How do we know Moshe was born on the 7th of Adar? He died on the 7th of Adar, we said, but he was also born on the 7th of Adar. Shenemar, because the pasuk says that Moshe says to the people, Vayomer aleihem, he said to them, Ben me'ah ve'asrim shana anochi hayom. Moshe says, he's talking to the people on his last day of his life, and he says, I'm 120 years old today. I can't go out and in anymore. Why does he say, I'm 120 years old today? Why did the Torah say today? Melamed is to teach you, Shakadosh Baruch Hu Yoshev. It's to teach us that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that God fulfills the days of tzaddikim, of the righteous, from day to day, meaning the tzaddikim are born and die on the same day. That's why it's telling you that Moshe, that he says, I'm 120 years old today, because this is the day that I was born, and it teaches me that tzaddikim live sort of this full life from that they die on the same day that they're born. And it quotes a pasuk, Shenemar, as the pasuk says, Es mispar yamecha amale. The pasuk says that Hashem promises, your days I will fulfill. And the Gemara again understands that to mean that a tzaddik, Hashem promises, or there's at least at times, if a person merits it, they will be both born and die on the same day. There seems to be some special significance to that, and that's what happened to Moshe Rabbeinu. Okay, so those were kind of tangential once we started talking about the man and Moshe Rabbeinu's death, so we got some of the details. Now we go back to the discussion of the Mishnah, which was about the mitzvos that apply only in Israel, the ones that apply everywhere. So the Gemara quotes a brisa. It says, Tanya, we learned in a brisa, Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai Omer. Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai says, Shalosh mitzvos nitzdavu Yisrael b'knisasam la'aretz. There are 3 mitzvos that the Jewish people received when they entered the land, or they only kicked in, they only took effect when they entered the land. V'nohagos bein ba'aretz bein b'chutz la'aretz. But yet those mitzvos, these 3 apply both in Eretz Yisrael and outside of Eretz Yisrael, even though they didn't apply apparently in the desert, but once they entered the land, they apply, and they'll apply both in Israel and outside of Israel. V'uadin sheinagu. And it's logical that they should apply both in and out. What are the three mitzvos? The three mitzvos are the three that we've discussed that apply outside of Israel. Chadash, that you can't use the new crop until you bring the Karban Omer on the second day of Pesach. Now, that we saw was a debate, but Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is taking the position that it applies outside of Israel. And the other two were Kilayim, crossbreeding your plants, and Arla, that you can't benefit from the fruits of a tree for the first 3 years. So the Gemara says, and Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says, it's logical that they should apply. And what he means is that by Chadash, he understands that it's explicit that it applies everywhere, because as we've discussed previously, by Chadash it says, Moshvo Sechem, your dwelling places. So, and he understands that to mean wherever you're dwelling. So Chadash, the pasuk says, applies everywhere. What about Arla and Kilayim? How do I know those apply everywhere? So he says it's logical as follows. Uma Chadash she'en yisro iser olam. If it's true that Chadash, which is not a permanent prohibition, ve'en yisro iser hana, and it's not forbidden to benefit from, v'yesh heter v'yisuro, and there's a way to be matir, to allow it, no hey bein ba'aretz bein b'chutz la'aretz, and that applies both in Israel and outside of Israel. Now, what are these three things that we just read? So again, we said that Chadash ein yisuro iser olam. It's not a permanent iser. What does that mean? So what that means is that we've discussed, right, that Chadash becomes permitted on the second day of Pesach. Now, there's different opinions about how that works. What if you don't bring the Karban Omer? So when does it become permitted? So Rashi quotes the opinion that it becomes permitted at the end of that second day of Pesach. And that's what he assumes this Gemara is going with. Others say already from the beginning of that day. If you don't have the Karban Omer to bring, then already in the morning of the second day of Pesach it becomes permitted. I think that's how we rule, in fact. But Rashi understands this Gemara, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, to be going with the opinion that it's at the end of that day. So he says, number one, it's not a permanent Isser, it's not a permanent prohibition, because it will be, the Chadash, the new crop, will become permitted no matter what, whether you bring the Karban Omer or not, at the end of the day on the 16th of Nisan, the second day of Pesach. That's number one. So that's a leniency. It becomes permitted on its own. Number two, it's not forbidden to benefit from. You're allowed to sell your Chadash, you just can't eat it. So that's a little bit more lenient. And number three, yesh heter liyisuro. There is a way to make it permitted earlier that day, which is by bringing the Karban Omer. So there's a way to actively permit it. So, and yet, despite all these leniencies, it's noheg bein ba'aretz bein b'chutz la'aretz. It applies both in Israel and outside of Israel. Right? That's the opinion that he's going with, based on the word mosh vosechem. So he's saying it applies everywhere. So he says if Chadash, which is a little bit more lenient, applies everywhere, Kilayim. So the prohibition of crossbreeding different foods. The Torah's case is grapes and wheat. So she'isur iser olam. There it becomes permanently forbidding. If a Jew plants crops close together and they mingle, so then the result is permanently forbidden. There's no way to permit that food. V'yisur iser hana, or I shouldn't say there's no way to permit that food. It never becomes permitted on its own. And it's forbidden not only to eat, but also to get any benefit from. Ve'eng heter liyisuran, and there's no way for a person, to make it permitted, actively. So all the leniencies that were true by Chadash are not true by Kilayim. So eino din sheinago bein ba'aretz bein b'chutz la'aretz. So isn't it all the more so that should apply both in Israel and outside of Israel. Meaning, if Chadash, which is generally lenient, still applies even outside of Israel, so Kilayim, mixed breeding, which is generally very strict in terms of its laws, isn't it all the more so that would it be strict and apply both in Israel and outside of Israel? And Arla also, we can make the same Kabbalah, the same argument, logical argument, at least with regards to two of those items, two of those three leniencies. Which two? So, different ways to understand this, I think, but the way Rashi says it is that Arla, the general prohibition of Arla, not the specific fruit, a fruit from the first 3 years is forbidden. The fourth year is its own category, actually. But eventually, the fruit of this tree will become permitted. So there's heter isuro, that the tree will eventually become permitting its fruit after 3 years. So that leniency is true by Arla as well. But Arla is forbidding Hana, you can't benefit from it, and you can't do anything to make it become permitted. And so those two stringencies are still true by Arla, so we can make the same Kal V'chomer, the same logic. If Chadash, which has all these leniencies, yet we're strict, that it applies even outside of Israel, so Arla, which is more strict in general, it's forbidden to benefit from, there's no way to make it permitted, so wouldn't we say all the more so it should have the stringency that it's forbidding outside of Israel? So that's the opinion of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, that all three of these things, these prohibitions, Chadash, Kilayim, and Arla, apply both in Israel and outside of Israel. Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon Omer, but Rabbi Elazar, the son of Reb Shimon, says, this is his son of Reb Shimon Bar Yochai, Rabbi Elazar says, otherwise, he says, Kol mitzvah shenitzdavu, we're on the top of the next page, Kol mitzvah shenitzdavu Yisrael kodem knisasan la'aretz, any mitzvah that the Jewish people were commanded in before they entered the land, no heges, bein ba'aretz, bein b'chutz la'aretz, applies both in Israel and outside of Israel. So basically, he's saying, chovas haguf, the obligations that are on the person, non-agricultural obligations, apply both in Israel and outside of Israel. But la'achar knisasan la'aretz, but the mitzvos that were only given after they enter the land, the mitzvos that only apply when you have the land of Israel, the agricultural mitzvos, eina noheges ela ba'aretz, they only apply in Israel. And he seems to be saying even Chadash, even Kilayim, even Arla only apply in Israel. Chutz, except, the exceptions are Chutz min hashmatas ksafim v'shiluach avadim. The exceptions are the halacha of hashmatas ksafim, which is the idea that at the end of the Shemitah year, according to most, the end of the Shemitah year, all loans become cancelled. Cancellation of loans. So Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon says that is only true in Eretz Yisrael. Sorry, he's saying even though that only came to apply after they entered the land of Israel, still it applies both in Israel and outside of Israel. That v'shiluach avadim, and the obligation for a person to free their slaves at the Jubilee year, at Yovel. That only began when they entered Israel, and yet it applies both in Israel and outside of Israel. Even though they were only commanding in them after they entered the land of Israel, no heges bein ba'aretz bein b'chutz la'aretz. They apply both in Israel and outside of Israel. So all the mitzvahs that they got before, that applied before they entered the land of Israel, apply both in Israel and outside of Israel. But the mitzvahs that only kicked in when they entered the land of Israel, those only apply in Israel, except for hashmatas ksafim, the cancellation of debts at the end of the Shemitah year, and shiluach avadim, the obligation to free one slave at the end of at Yovel, at the Jubilee. Those apply both in Israel and outside of Israel. So the Gemara now is going to ask about each of those things. We'll do the first one this week and the next one next week. So the Gemara says, Hashmatas ksafim, chovas hagufi. Hashmatas ksafim, the cancellation of debts. That's a mitzvah, that's land related. That's a chovas haguf, that's on the person. So what does Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon mean that only began when they entered the land of Israel? It was, all the mitzvahs were given at Har Sinai, right? So, and it had nothing to do with the land. Canceling debts at the Shemitah year has nothing to do with the land. So why would that be something that he's calling, it only began, it's a mitzvah that only kicked in when they entered the land of Israel, but yet it applies even outside of Israel. Why didn't it apply before they entered the land of Israel? It's a chovas haguf, it's an obligation on the person. So the Gemara explains, no, we need it still based on the following brisa. The Tanya, the brisa says, Rabbi Yehuda Anasi says, the pasuk says with regards to Shemitah, it says, V'zeh dvar Shemitah. This is the matter of Shemitah. Shamot, it says that one should be Shamot kol ba'al mashayada. Basically, the cancellation of debts. Shamot should cancel anybody that owes. So, says the brisa, Bishtei Shmitos hakasav medaber. It sounds like the pasuk here is referring to two aspects of Shemitah. Because it says, V'zeh dvar Shemitah. This is the matter of Shemitah. Shamot. And then it repeats Shamot. So it sounds like it's referring to two things here. What are they? Achas Shmitas Karka. Ve'achas Shmitas Ksafim. One refers to the idea of Shemitah of Karka, Shemitah of the land. Letting the land lay fallow. Sorry, actually, one second. It could either refer to the first Shemitah, the Shemitah of Karka, could either refer to letting the land lay fallow, like our classic Shemitah when we think of Shemitah. It may also refer to at the Yovel, the lands return to their owners. I'm not sure if it will make that much of a difference, as we'll see in a moment. Ve'achas Shmitas Ksafim. And then the other mention of Shemitah here refers to what we're discussing, Shemitah of money, the cancellation of debts. And it's teaching you as follows. Bizman she'ata mishamet karka. In a time where you are mishamet the karka, where you do observe Shemitah on karka. And again, we said there's two possibilities, but I think they're dependent on each other anyways. What it means is, when Shemitah applies according to the Torah, according to Torah law, nowadays it's D'Rabbanan, it's rabbinic, seemingly. So, when does Shemitah apply according to Torah law? It's when Yovel applies. And Yovel has to do with, I think, whether Jews have control of Israel and how many Jews live in Israel and different things like that. So when the laws of Yovel apply, which means that the laws of Shemitah are applying on a Torah level and lands are returning to their owners in the Yovel year, so then Ata Mishamet Ksafim. So then the laws of Shemitah of money, the cancellation of debts, applies as well on a Torah level. But Bisman She'yata Mishamet Karka, but if there's no Shemitah on the land, Yovel is not being practiced, Iyata Mishamet Ksafim, so then there's also, on a Torah level at least, no Shemitah of Ksafim, there's no cancellation of debts. So therefore what he's basically saying is that really the laws of Shmitas Ksafim, of canceling debts, did only come to apply when they entered the land of Israel, because even though it's a chovas haguf, even though it's an obligation on the person, but it's dependent on the Shemitah of the land. So since the Shemitah of the land only kicked in when they entered the land of Israel, so therefore the Shemitah of money only applies when they enter the land of Israel. So that's what Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon is coming to say, that even though it only applied when they entered the land of Israel, but it still applies everywhere. The Gemara asks, Ve'ema, but maybe you're making the wrong drasha, the wrong teaching here. Ve'ema bin makom she'ata meshamit karka ata meshamit ksafim. Uben makom she'ata meshamit karka ata meshamit ksafim. The Brisa assumed, the Brisa said that by mentioning two Shemitas next to each other, what it's telling you is that when Shemitah applies to the land, Shemitah applies to the money, and at a time that Shemitah doesn't apply to the land, Shemitah doesn't apply to the money. Says the Gemara, but maybe the way you should say is, in a place where Shemitah applies to the land, it applies to the money, and in a place where it doesn't apply to the land, it doesn't apply to the money, which would mean that Shemitah's Ksafim, the cancellation of debts, only applies in Israel, not outside of Israel. So how does Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon know to say that that Shemitah's Ksafim, cancellation of debts, applies everywhere, not only in Israel, but even outside of Israel? Maybe this verse should be teaching us that no, it only applies in a place where the Shemitah of the land applies, which is only in Israel. So says the Gemara, Talmud Lomar, that's why the Torah says, Ki kara Shemitah la Hashem. The pasuk says, that same pasuk about Shemitah's Ksafim, about canceling debts. It says at the end of the verse, Ki kara Shemitah la Hashem, for you have called Shemitah to God. So the Gemara says, that tells us Mikol Makom, wherever you are. In other words, I think what it's saying is that the pasuk implies that as long as it's Shemitah la Hashem, as long as it's a year of Shemitah, so then this pasuk applies. This pasuk, which deals with cancellation of debts, will apply wherever you might be. As long as it's Kara Shemitah la Hashem, as long as it's a year of Shemitah to God, so then the cancellation of debts is going to apply wherever you are. It's only in a time when there's no Shemitah la Hashem. If there's no Shemitah, so then you're not going to have Shemitah's Ksafim, you're not going to have cancellation of debts, at least on a Torah level. But as long as there is Shemitah somewhere, then, meaning in Israel, so then the laws of Shemitah's Ksafim, of cancellation of debts, will apply both in Israel and outside of Israel, according to Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon.